Good morning, everybody, and hey Zeke, hope everybody's doing well there. My name is Jake Alleman. I'm a captain in the United States Space Force, previously of the United States Air Force, transitioned over actually about a month ago at this point. But I'm a cyberspace operations officer by trade, focused in the defensive cyber operations field, so basically protecting networks from adversaries and aggressive actors. Everything I say today is my own opinion. Just as a caveat, this is not informed by, nor does it represent the opinions of the Department of Defense, the Department of the Space Force, Department of the Air Force, or really any other government organization. This is just me. So here today to talk to you a little bit about both cyber and cyber intelligence and how that can be something that can be related to your class and everything that you guys are going over right now. So wanted to go over a few things about how cyber works in the world today and how it impacts your lives and various aspects of how intelligence feeds and informs all of that. With that, hopefully you were able to watch the quick little video ahead of time, about a 3-minute video that was showing kind of a real world representation of what cyber looks like, but with the interactions between people. That was a fun little video, mostly because it helps translate what is oftentimes a difficult concept into something that's a little bit more palatable and understandable to the layperson that doesn't necessarily have a strong background or expertise when it comes to cyber and networking. So as we go into it, one of the hardest questions to answer is what exactly is cyberspace? So when you hear cyberspace, a lot of times the standard thought is going to the Matrix or anything like that. But then there's the other more mundane side of it where the assumption is, it's just like computers and email and stuff. So that's not just an issue for everybody on the normal civilian side to answer. It's also an issue for those in a cyber career field, be it on the civilian side or in the government side, to define as well. There isn't really an understood universal definition for cyberspace. Is it just the routers and switches and computers that make up computer networks? Or does cyberspace actually include things like everything that lives there, like your health records or your bank records? Does it include your car that at this point has more computers in it than a lot of other devices that have ever existed in history? Does it include the baby monitor that's in your child's nursery that's connected through Wi-Fi back out to the cloud where now people can access it? So cyberspace, the definition of it tends to shift depending on who you ask, which complicates a lot of the matter of how you inform intelligence on it and how you effectively operate within cyberspace. So why does all this matter? Well, I want to take you through a few examples of major world impacting events that have happened through cyberspace that kind of define a lot of what we have to deal with, those in my profession on a day-to-day basis. So the best place to start, in my opinion, would be the Stuxnet attack. This was way back when, like over 2 decades ago, where there's no actual defined guaranteed who was the instigator for that event, but ultimately the result was several Iranian nuclear facilities ended up being attacked via a cyber attack that destroyed a lot of the equipment that's used at those facilities in order to enrich uranium. One of the articles that I read at the time kind of referred to Stuxnet as a modern fighter jet showing up on a World War I battlefield. It really was that far and above anything else that had ever been seen before. It was completely new, completely out of the ordinary, and it redefined a lot of what cyberspace and cyberspace operations could be considered to be. So I view Stuxnet as a turning point of where cyberspace became something that was more of a science fiction type thing and grand thoughts of the future into a hard reality of this is something that individuals, governments, organizations, companies have to take seriously because of the fact that cyberspace can have that tangible impact. So next after that, a little bit later on down the chain, was the Maersk hack. So this was the NotPetya attack that took place a few years ago. That the initial attack itself was a Russian attack on a Ukrainian power grid, but as is the case oftentimes with cyber, things tend to get a little bit out of control. In this case, the attack ended up spreading to the company Maersk, which is a Danish shipping company. It happens to be the largest shipping company in the world. And they have operations basically in every single country that there is. And this attack crippled the entire company. They were basically unable to operate for several weeks to the cost of something in the hundreds of millions of dollars for the company itself and billions of dollars of losses for the world economy writ large, because so much depended on this company being able to ship things from point A to point B. And that was largely because the company had no real policy for backing up its data and did not keep its systems patched and up to date. So while they weren't necessarily the target of the attack because of their not ideal cyber practices, we'll say, they ended up being the biggest victim of that hack. So Maersk would be another great example of how cyber can impact organizations on a grand scale, and because those organizations get impacted, they impact the individuals that rely on those organizations. So going into the next one that was even more recent, the city of Atlanta in 2019 was actually attacked under a ransomware attack. So ransomware attacks, basically an attacker gets into your system, encrypts all the data on the system, and will not give you the key to unencrypt it unless you pay them money. So the ransom aspect of it. Atlanta was hit with this, and unfortunately, they chose not to pay the instigators of the attack whatever the fee was that they demanded, or the ransom was, or as sometimes happens, the attackers don't actually have any intent of unencrypting what they lock, so they'll take the money, laugh, and leave the victim crippled and unable to get back on their feet. So in this case, Atlanta ended up having to spend millions of dollars to try to recover from this attack, and about half of their government organizations within the city were, for all intents and purposes, crippled for at least a week, in some cases a little bit more. Where they were unable to effectively perform their government roles, which obviously not great when you're talking about a huge metropolis like Atlanta. You want to make sure that things like your utilities are functioning, your police force is able to function, et cetera, et cetera. Those being two of the examples of parts of the government that were shut down during that attack. And then the most recent one you may have heard about in the news relatively lately is the SolarWinds attack. So this one ties the most into intelligence because of the fact that it really was an intelligence coup for the Russians, most likely the Russians, which I'll get to in a bit about the most likely bit. But basically, for some context, SolarWinds is a piece of software that a lot of organizations use in order to monitor their networks. So really that's all it is it's a very easy go-to place where you can look at it and say, okay, my entire network is green across the board, or this router over here is broken, or these computers over here are not on the network anymore for whatever reason. It just gives you a snapshot of everything that you see. And the only way that it's able to do that is because it has access into every system on that network, which makes it a perfect target for attackers to try to get into, because if they can get into SolarWinds, that means they can get into everything else on that network, which is why this particular attack is such a big deal and was covered so heavily in the news, is because there are hundreds, if not thousands, of organizations across the world that use this software in order to monitor their network, which basically means that whoever instigated that attack had complete access to all of those organizations and all of those networks. So huge security risk, huge problem for a lot of companies and organizations and governments to try to wrap their heads around to see, okay, if this was real, or if we had this software running at this time, we have to assume that everything was compromised across those networks during that time frame. So I say most likely it was the Russians. That's what a lot of open source folks are pointing to right now, and analysts, just because it bears a lot of the markers of some of the more advanced persistent threats that some of the Russian intelligence services use. But unfortunately with cyber, there is the huge issue of attribution, where it can be nigh on impossible to be able to pin down exactly who it was that's responsible for any given attack, just because there are so many ways to change where it looks like the attack is coming from to actually change where the attack's coming from a physical sense of breaking into another computer that you use to break into another computer that you use to break into another computer that you then use that computer to launch your attack on SolarWinds or whatever the case may be. So anybody that's in a position like I am where you're trying to defend a network, if you're trying to reach back and find out where that came from, not only do you have to find a needle in a haystack to begin with, but then that's only going to lead you to another haystack, to another haystack, to another haystack, all the way down the chain, and you don't really know where that chain's going to end, or if you'll ever find the end. So it makes things very frustrating at times to be able to pin it down specifically. So when I say most likely, it's because that's what a lot of experts are saying is based off of the tactics, techniques, and procedures that were used in the attack. Most likely it looks like the Russians, but it could have been a criminal organization, it could have been another government, and it could have been just some very creative and lucky teenager working out of a garage somewhere that's a lot smarter than I am. So hard to always pin those things down. So when I'm talking about cyberspace and cyber attacks and whatnot, and as it applies to hopefully what I think is being covered in your class about the psychology of intelligence, I want to go a little bit into how the psychology of cyber really does play a huge role in everything that occurs within cyber operations. So the general thought that I'm sure many of you have of what a cyber attack looks like probably comes from Hollywood. And Hollywood does not do a good job whatsoever when it comes to depicting what cyber really looks like. So generally speaking, you've got the person in the hoodie in a dark room just typing away and like, oh, I'm getting into the mainframe, bypassing the firewall. Like all of that is pretty much garbage. Cyber is not something that takes place on a quick timeline by any means. While yes, everything travels at the speed of light, it takes months to really instigate a proper attack against a hardened target. There's a lot of research and effort that has to go into any attack of worthwhile status, because generally speaking, the worthwhile targets are the ones that are well defended, and that means that there's going to be a lot of effort that needs to happen in order to circumvent those defenses. So Mr. Robot, if you were looking for a good example of what cyber really looks like in the real world, the show Mr. Robot does a pretty good job of outlining a lot of the research that needs to go into it, how methodical and step-by-step and incremental cyber does have to be. Rarely are you ever going to see the situation where one attack gets you exactly to the place that you want to be. Because generally speaking, again, the places you want to be are the ones that are highly defended. So they're in that core that's surrounded by a bunch of different defenses all over the place. So what you end up having to do is you come in from the exterior way over here, and then you go from here, you manage to work your way up to here, gets you over to this system over here, and then up to here, this system, and then that system happens to connect into the system that you want to get into. So you've got to work your way through an entire network to eventually reach the place that you want to be. So if you're slamming through it like a bull in a china shop, like you usually see in representations of cyber in Hollywood, people pick up on that. People are relatively good when it comes to trying to stop things that they don't want to happen. And same thing when it comes to cyberspace, is if you're just going to try to blow through something, sensors pick up on that, people pick up on that. It becomes easy to recognize that you're under attack. So that's why the slow, methodical pace is generally speaking what people go for. So with that, there is also a misconception in regards to what it takes to defend from a cyber attack. So there are two different avenues. There's the technical avenue, and then there's the person avenue. On the technical side, the Windows Defender app that you have probably installed on Windows right now, because it comes standard with your computer and with Windows 10, that is by far and large more than enough to protect your system from anything that you're going to face out there, as long as you're keeping your system up to date. In all reality, you don't need anything else beyond that. So the only exceptions to that would be zero-day attacks, which is an attack that nobody knows that this is a vulnerability, in which case if nobody knows that it's a vulnerability, there's nothing you can do to defend against it because nobody knows about it. So you can't really patch something that you don't know exists. So 0 days are relatively rare, but and generally speaking, those aren't people that are using those to go after your computer. They're using those to go after targets like governments and massive organizations and et cetera, because they can get a lot more bang for their buck hacking into Bank of America than they'll ever be able to get hacking into your laptop. So you don't really need to worry too much about 0 day threats. The other one would be advanced persistent threats, or APTs, which is just industry jargon for specific nation states teams that their entire purpose in life is to conduct cyber attacks. So basically, every major country has some form of APT, whether it's tied to their military, tied to their intelligence organizations, whatever the case may be. But these are the people that have the time and the resources to really work their way through a network and find whatever target that they need to find. With enough time and effort, generally speaking, you can manage to get at least close, if not to, the actual target that you want. But again, no country is going to be focusing all of the time and effort and resources that it takes to utilize an APT to focus on your computer. So you're pretty safe. For all intents and purposes, on the technical side, you're covered. So that leaves the personnel side. The news will have plenty of examples of how individuals, organizations, companies, governments, blah, 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 keep getting hacked all the time. And it's because the weakest link of any network defense is you as a human being. By far and large, the vast majority of cyber attacks are only possible because there is a user who opens the front door for that attacker to come in. And that happens in a vast variety of ways. There are a ton of different things that attackers can do in order to basically trick you into letting them in. I'm sure we've all seen the memes and the examples of the Nigerian prince emailing out like, I've got $38 million and I just need you to give me your bank account number so I can transfer that over to you. It's the same exact concept as that. Is it somebody who is speaking from either a position of authority, or they're speaking to a desire that you have, or whatever the case may be? There are a ton of different psychological triggers that attackers will use in order to convince you to give them something that they need to get into your system. So the most prevalent these days is called phishing. So a lot of phishing attempts come via email, where they'll send something from probably a position of authority, or they'll send something in regards to a very time-sensitive nature. So one that I see in my email inbox relatively frequently is there will be an email that looks like it's coming from Apple saying that, your account is about to be locked out unless you click here and verify that you are who you say you are. Apple's never going to send you that. So anytime you see something like that, you can be sure this is not coming from a verified source. This is coming from somebody trying to get me to click on this link. Because when you click on a link, generally speaking, that gives that attacker a level of access into your system. So because you have chosen to accept that connection to them, your computer now trusts that connection to enough of an extent that they're able to get a foothold and start pulling data from you to start loading malware onto your computer, et cetera, et cetera. So phishing is just the general concept for that. There are subsets within it, like spear phishing, for example, is when you're targeting a specific group of people. So, for example, if a foreign intelligence agency was wanting to go after cyber officers within the United States military, like if they could craft some sort of attack specific to us, and that could be built around a measure of trust that we would have, where we're looking for training opportunities or looking for stuff from our leadership or whatever the case may be. They would tailor it to that group that they're targeting. Another one would be whaling. So whaling is when you're going after specific high value targets. So say a attacker is going after the CEO of Microsoft. Like that would be considered a whaling attack because that would be highly tailored and specific to that individual. So they would go through his entire past and see what they could dig up of, okay, he's got this old friend from high school that he was very fond of. So if we pretend to be that person, reaching out to him after a long time, maybe that will be enough for him to trust whatever we're sending him, that he'll be able to click on this link or open that attachment or whatever we need him to do in order for us to get into his system. So you see tiered levels of attacks when it comes to phishing and all social engineering, really. It all comes down to the fact that we as human beings, we like to respond to authority, especially in areas that we don't necessarily understand ourselves, like cyber. So as an example, how often do you check to see if the email that you just got from your school is actually from your school or not? Or do you just look at it and think, okay, yeah, I'm used to seeing this sort of format on an email from my school, so I assume that everything in here is correct, and there's an attachment on here that they want me to open and read. Cool. I'll open that up because it says it's from the school bursar and I need to make sure that my fees are being paid appropriately. Do you even think about that, or do you just go ahead and click on it? It's because we expect that those things that look like what they should look like, and they're coming from a source we think that they should be coming from, we automatically trust that level of authority that email has. And we don't necessarily do our due diligence to make sure that that's where it's coming from. So